It happened in the middle of a crowded street. An ordinary afternoon shattered by a moment of cruelty that no one expected to witness. A man, consumed by anger, raised his hand and struck his dog. The sound echoed against the pavement, and for a brief moment, time seemed to stop. People looked away, pretending not to see, afraid to get involved. The dog didn't bark or fight back. It simply lowered its head, trembling in silence, its loyalty met with violence. But what no one knew was that justice was already on its way, roaring down the road on two wheels. From a distance, the deep rumble of motorcycle engines grew louder, like thunder warning of a coming storm. Heads turned as a group of bikers approached, their presence heavy and commanding. They saw what others had chosen to ignore, the helpless creature cowering beside a man who had forgotten what compassion meant. Without exchanging a word, the riders slowed down, forming a circle around the man, their leather jackets glinting under the sun like armor forged from principle and fury. The crowd began to whisper, sensing something powerful in the air. The man who moments before had felt untouchable now stood frozen, surrounded by figures who carried no badges, no weapons, only the unspoken authority of people who live by a code stronger than fear. Their silence was deafening, their eyes sharp with purpose. The man's arrogance faltered as he realized this was no random encounter. This was judgment in motion. One of the bikers, the leader, dismounted and knelt beside the trembling dog. He didn't speak to the abuser first. He spoke softly to the animal, letting it sniff his hand, reassuring it with a kindness the world had just denied. Then, he looked up, his gaze cold, unwavering, and heavy with meaning. "You don't hurt what trusts you," he said, his voice calm yet cutting through the air like steel. The man took a step back, his confidence replaced by fear. In that instant, the balance shifted completely. The dog, once the victim, was now protected. The abuser, once the predator, was now exposed. The bikers didn't need to raise their fists or shout to deliver justice. Their unity, their silence, and their presence were punishment enough. And as the engines roared once more, the crowd watched in awe, realizing they had just witnessed something rare in this world. Justice served not by law, but by humanity. The man stood frozen as the circle of bikers tightened around him. The air grew thick with tension, the sound of idling engines humming like a warning. No one dared to move. The crowd, once indifferent, now watched in silence, realizing they were witnessing something rare, a confrontation between cruelty and justice, raw and unfiltered. The abuser's defiance began to fade under the weight of so many piercing eyes. For the first time, he felt what the dog had felt only moments before: fear, powerlessness, and shame. The leader of the group stepped closer, his boots heavy against the asphalt. He didn't need to shout to be heard. His presence carried authority born from years of standing up for those who couldn't defend themselves. "You think strength means hurting what's weaker than you," he said, his voice calm but layered with steel. The man didn't answer. His trembling hands gave away everything his pride tried to hide. Around him, the other bikers stood still as statues, their silence louder than any threat. Then, one of them reached for the dog. The animal hesitated at first, unsure whether it could trust these towering figures with roaring machines. But when the biker gently extended his hand and whispered, "It's okay now, buddy," the dog took a slow step forward. The crowd exhaled as the animal pressed its head into the biker's palm, as if recognizing a protector. In that simple gesture, the balance of power shifted completely. The abuser no longer owned the moment. Compassion did. The leader looked back at the man one last time. "You're lucky we believe in second chances," he said quietly. "But know this. Next time, you won't be facing just us. You'll be facing yourself." It wasn't a threat. It was truth delivered like a sentence, cutting deeper than any blow could. The man lowered his eyes, unable to meet the weight of justice that stood before him. When the bikers finally walked away, they didn't celebrate or look back. They moved as one, the sound of their engines rising into the air like a vow, a promise that as long as cruelty existed, they would not remain silent. And behind them, the dog followed, not because it was told to, but because it had found safety for the first time. The video of the confrontation spread within hours. A bystander had filmed everything: the strike, the silence, and the justice that followed. Within a day, it had reached millions. People across the world watched in disbelief and awe as a group of leather-clad riders stood up for a creature that had no voice. The comments flooded in. Some called it poetic justice. Others said it restored their faith in humanity. For once, the internet united around something pure, an act of courage with no expectation of reward. Meanwhile, the bikers went about their lives as if nothing had changed. For them, it wasn't about fame or glory. They had always lived by a simple rule: protect those who cannot protect themselves. They'd seen too much darkness on the road to ignore pain when it appeared in front of them. What they did that day wasn't extraordinary. It was instinct. The same instinct that had bound them together long before anyone knew their names. The man who had struck his dog was soon identified. Faced with public outrage and legal consequences, he was forced to confront the reflection of his own actions. For the first time, he saw himself not as the powerful figure he once believed he was, but as a man exposed by the very cruelty he had tried to hide. The lesson came hard, but it came, and sometimes that's the only way people learn. As for the dog, it was taken in by one of the bikers, a man named Cole who had lost his own companion years ago. He named the dog Justice. In the weeks that followed, photos began to appear online. Justice riding in the sidecar of Cole's motorcycle, ears flapping in the wind, eyes bright with trust. What had started as a moment of pain became a symbol of healing for both of them. And somewhere between the roar of the engines and the quiet loyalty of the rescued dog, the world was reminded of something simple but powerful. Kindness isn't about softness. Real kindness carries strength. It protects, it defends, and when necessary, it stands up in the middle of a crowd and says, "Enough." As days passed, the story continued to ripple across the world. People began to send messages to the biker club, letters of gratitude, photos of rescued animals, and stories of strangers standing up against cruelty. What had begun as one act of justice had awakened something larger, a collective reminder that courage can exist in ordinary people. The bikers, once seen by many as intimidating or reckless, became symbols of compassion forged through strength. News stations reached out for interviews, but the group refused to glorify themselves. Their leaders simply said, "We didn't do anything special. We just did what others were too afraid to do." His words resonated deeply, striking at a truth everyone knew but few lived by: that justice isn't about authority. It's about conscience. And conscience doesn't wait for permission. The rescued dog, Justice, became the heart of the group. Everywhere the bikers went, the animal rode proudly with them, his fur whipping in the wind as if he'd been born for the road. Crowds gathered whenever they stopped, not out of curiosity, but out of respect. Children would run up to pet him, their laughter echoing through the streets, and even the toughest of the riders couldn't help but smile. The once broken dog now carried the spirit of freedom and healing wherever he went. But not everyone celebrated. There were those who saw the bikers act as defiance, an example of people taking matters into their own hands. Some questioned whether it was their place to interfere. Yet those doubts faded each time someone remembered the image of that trembling animal and the silence of those who had done nothing. It was easier to criticize from the sidelines than to stand in the middle of the storm. And so, the bikers kept riding, not to prove a point, but to live their truth. Each journey reminded them why they had acted that day, not out of rage, but out of love. A love that refuses to stay quiet when innocence is broken. A love that understands true justice doesn't always wear uniform. It sometimes wears leather and rides on two wheels. Weeks later, the group received an invitation from an animal shelter. The staff wanted to honor them for their courage and show how their act had inspired hundreds of adoptions. The shelter, once struggling to find homes for abandoned pets, was now filled with families waiting to adopt. It was as if that one moment in the street had reignited something long forgotten, the belief that compassion could still move people to action. When the bikers arrived, engines rumbling, children cheered and ran toward them, holding signs that read, "Be their voice." Justice trotted proudly beside his rider, tail wagging, no trace of fear left in his eyes. For those watching, it was more than a visit. It was a celebration of redemption, a moment that showed how even the deepest scars can heal when met with understanding and care. Inside the shelter, the leader spoke softly to the volunteers. "You're the real heroes," he said. "We just showed up once. You show up every day." His humility touched everyone in the room. They realized that what made these men and women remarkable wasn't their strength or their image. It was their humanity. The same humanity that had been missing in that crowded street on the day everything began. Later, as the bikers prepared to leave, one of the children approached and asked, "Why did you help the dog? You didn't even know him." The leader knelt down, smiling gently. "Because doing nothing," he said, "would have made us know better than the man who hurt him." The child nodded, holding on to those words like a lesson meant to last a lifetime. As the engines roared back to life, the shelter staff and families waved, their cheers fading into the distance. The bikers didn't look back. They didn't need to. They knew the world was a little better than it had been the day before, and that was all the reward they would ever need. As the weeks turned into months, the impact of that single moment kept growing. People who had watched the viral video began to act differently. They spoke up when they saw injustice, they intervened when someone was in danger, and they taught their children that kindness requires courage. What the bikers had done that day wasn't just an act of justice. It was a spark that ignited something bigger. The world had been reminded that silence is the accomplice of cruelty, and that even one voice, one action, can change everything. Justice, the dog, became a legend in his own right. Every ride, every photo, every story about him carried a message of hope. His transformation from a trembling victim to a symbol of freedom moved hearts everywhere. Animal rescue groups used his story to inspire donations. Schools shared it to teach empathy, and thousands of strangers adopted pets in his honor. The dog who once cowered beneath his abuser's hand now stood proudly beside his protectors, his eyes alive with trust and peace. The man who had hurt him eventually disappeared from the public eye, swallowed by the consequences of his actions. But his absence mattered little. What endured was the lesson. Cruelty, when exposed to light, loses its power. And the world had seen enough of it that day to remember for a lifetime that strength without compassion is nothing but weakness in disguise. The bikers continued their rides, crossing towns and borders, helping where they could. Sometimes they found stray animals, sometimes lost souls, but always they carried the same code with them: respect, loyalty, and protection. To outsiders, they looked like a gang. To those who understood, they were something much greater, a moving army of kindness on two wheels, bound not by rules, but by conscience. And though they never called themselves heroes, others did. Because in a world often blinded by fear and indifference, they had done what most people only talk about. They had acted. They had chosen to stand between cruelty and innocence, and that choice changed everything. One evening, months after the incident, the bikers gathered by the coast. The sun was setting in a blaze of orange and red, reflecting off their motorcycles like fire across steel. Justice sat beside them, his head resting on the leader's leg as waves crashed in the distance. The group spoke little. They didn't need to. The silence between them was filled with unspoken understanding. Each one knew they had witnessed something that would stay with them forever. The leader finally broke the silence. "Funny how one moment can change everything," he said. "We didn't go there looking for trouble, but maybe the world needed to see that day." The others nodded, their faces thoughtful. They had ridden through countless towns, seen injustice in many forms, but this time it felt different. This time, the world had seen their hearts, not their jackets. Justice lifted his head, watching the horizon. The wind brushed through his fur, as if nature itself acknowledged the peace he'd found. For him, the pain of that cruel moment had become a distant echo, replaced by love and belonging. He had found a family not through blood, but through action, and that, perhaps, was the most beautiful redemption of all. As darkness fell, the bikers prepared to ride again. Their engines growled softly, blending with the rhythm of the waves. Each ride they took was a reminder that the world will always need people willing to stand between harm and innocence. The leader patted Justice's head one last time before putting on his helmet. "Let's go," he said. "There's always someone else out there who needs a little justice." And with that, The engines roared to life once more, echoing through the night like a heartbeat of defiance and hope. The horizon swallowed them, but their message remained behind, etched in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed the power of compassion when it refuses to stay silent. The next morning, the town awoke to news that the biker club had launched a new initiative, Ride for Justice. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about action. Their goal was simple: to travel from town to town, spreading awareness about kindness, respect, and animal welfare. Wherever they went, they spoke in schools, visited shelters, and encouraged people to defend those who couldn't speak for themselves. Their message was raw, unpolished, but profoundly real. Strength means nothing if it's not used to protect. Communities that once feared the thunder of motorcycles now welcomed it as a sign of safety. When people heard the engines roar in the distance, they didn't lock their doors. They stepped outside, waving, knowing that help had arrived. The bikers had become a force of good, rewriting what it meant to be tough. They proved that compassion wasn't weakness. It was the purest form of power. And wherever they went, stories followed. Stray dogs rescued, lost children helped, elderly neighbors visited. Justice rode with them every mile, sitting proudly in the sidecar beside the leader, a living emblem of everything they stood for. His story had become inseparable from theirs, a symbol of how even the smallest act of protection can ripple outward into something much larger. Each time he barked, it was as if the world was reminded that hope still had a voice. Children would run to greet him, their laughter blending with the sound of engines, turning fear into joy. But amid all the good they did, the leader often found himself reflecting on that first day, the cruelty they had witnessed and the silence of the crowd. That image haunted him more than the violence itself. "We were just lucky to be there," he said one night around a fire. But how many times does this happen when no one is watching? The question lingered in the air like smoke, settling deep into the hearts of those who heard it. And that became their true mission, not just to intervene when cruelty appeared, but to teach others not to wait for the bikers to arrive. To show the world that anyone, no matter how small, how ordinary, could stand up for what's right. Because real justice isn't a performance. It's a choice made quietly, in the moments when no one is looking. Months later, as the Ride for Justice movement grew, the bikers returned to the very same town where it had all begun. The square was different now, brighter, cleaner, alive. Posters of rescued animals adorned the walls, and a new sign stood in the center: "Kindness starts here." The crowd that had once stood silent in that same place now gathered again, this time to celebrate compassion. Children held handmade signs with Justice's paw print painted in red, symbolizing courage through love. The leader stepped forward, removing his helmet as the crowd erupted in applause. But he didn't bask in it. Instead, he smiled humbly and said, "We're not here to be heroes. We're here to remind you that you don't need leather or engines to be brave. All it takes is heart." His words were simple, but they sank deep into everyone who heard them. Because deep down, people knew he was right. The power to change the world had always been in their hands. Justice wagged his tail beside him, as if understanding every word. When the leader crouched down and pointed to the dog, he said, "This little guy isn't just a survivor. He's proof that no matter how much darkness you face, there's always light waiting if someone chooses to protect it." The square fell silent for a moment, the kind of silence that carries meaning rather than emptiness. Then, the crowd began to chant, "Justice! Justice!" The sound grew, echoing through the streets that had once echoed with cruelty. It was a moment of redemption, not just for the town, but for humanity itself. People wept, smiled, and reached out to one another, united by the reminder that compassion is contagious. As the engines roared to life again, the leader looked around one last time. The crowd wasn't silent anymore. They had found their voices, their courage, and their purpose. And as the bikers rode away into the golden horizon, Justice barking proudly at their side, it was clear that what had begun as one act of defiance had become a movement, one that would keep roaring long after the engines faded into the distance. As the months passed, the Ride for Justice movement grew beyond anything the bikers could have imagined. What began as a single act of compassion became a global call to action. Motorcycle clubs from other cities, and even other countries, began joining the cause. They didn't just ride for adventure anymore. They rode for purpose. Across highways and coastlines, you could see them, lines of bikers carrying the same emblem, the same mission, the same spirit. Each of them carrying the message that kindness could be fierce, and justice, when guided by love, could roar louder than cruelty. News channels followed their journey, calling it a revolution of compassion. But for the bikers, it was never about fame. It was about responsibility. Every time they stopped in a new town, they met people who had been afraid to speak up, afraid to intervene. They reminded them that standing for what's right doesn't require strength. It only requires the courage to care. One simple act of humanity could change the entire course of someone's life. Justice, the dog, remained the heart of it all. His story reached places the bikers never could. Schools used his image to teach children empathy. Hospitals invited him to visit patients, and artists painted murals of his journey. To the world, he was more than a dog. He was proof that love can heal what cruelty breaks. Every time he rode beside the bikers, tail high and proud, people stopped in their tracks, smiling, crying, believing again in the goodness they thought the world had lost. But the bikers also knew the road was endless. There would always be another act of cruelty to confront, another innocent life to protect. They accepted it not as a burden, but as a calling. They weren't saviors. They were reminders that humanity still had a pulse, and that sometimes the simplest gesture could be the loudest act of rebellion. And so, the journey continued, through storms, deserts, and cities that had forgotten what compassion looked like. Wherever they went, they left something behind, not just tire marks, but hope. Because when people saw them, they didn't just see bikers, they saw justice in motion. Years later, the legend of the bikers and the dog became more than just a story. It became a movement engraved in memory. People who had witnessed their ride told the tale to their children, who would one day tell it to theirs. The message remained unchanged. Real strength is measured not by power, but by protection. And true justice isn't vengeance. It's love that refuses to stay silent. The leader, now older, sat one evening by the side of the road, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Justice lay beside him, his muzzle gray, his eyes still full of life. The years had taken their toll, but the bond between man and dog had only grown stronger. "You did good, buddy," he whispered softly, his voice carrying the weight of gratitude. The dog lifted his head and rested it gently against his arm, as if to say, "So did you." As night fell, the other bikers arrived. They lit a small fire, their laughter echoing softly in the quiet air. They had faced countless miles together, seen both the darkness and the beauty of humanity. But this peace, was their greatest victory. No medals, no headlines, no monuments could compare to the feeling of knowing they had made the world just a little kinder. Justice passed peacefully that night, surrounded by the family that had found him when no one else cared. The next morning, they buried him under an old oak tree near the coast, marking the spot with a plaque that read, "He rode with courage and taught the world what love truly means." The ceremony was quiet, but the message was eternal. When the bikers rode off that day, they didn't cry. They smiled, because justice's spirit wasn't gone. It rode with them in every echo of the engine, in every act of protection, in every choice to stand up for what's right. And as the sun rose behind them, the road ahead seemed endless, glowing with the promise that compassion, once awakened, never truly dies. It just keeps riding. In the end, what began as an act of cruelty turned into one of the most powerful stories of redemption and compassion the world had ever seen. A single moment of violence revealed two paths, one defined by indifference and the other by courage. And when those engines roared that day, they carried more than noise. They carried a message that echoed through every heart that witnessed it. It was a reminder that kindness, when defended fiercely, can shake the world to its core. Justice, the dog who once trembled in fear, became a symbol of strength that transcended borders, languages, and generations. He reminded people that love, even when wounded, can be reborn through courage. The bikers who had come to his rescue didn't just protect an animal. They reignited faith in humanity. Through their loyalty, the world was reminded that the true measure of a person's strength isn't found in muscle or money, but in the heart that chooses to protect instead of harm. As time passed, the roar of their engines faded into legend, but the lesson they left behind continues to live on. It calls to each of us, quietly yet insistently, asking, when the moment comes, will you stay silent, or will you act? Because justice doesn't always arrive in uniforms or in courts. Sometimes it rides on two wheels, wears leather, and carries compassion stronger than any weapon. Every act of kindness, no matter how small, creates a ripple that travels farther than we can see. It reminds us that standing up for what's right will always matter, even when the world looks the other way. The bikers didn't change the world with speeches or laws. They changed it with courage, unity, and love that refused to back down. And that is a legacy no cruelty can erase. If this story moved you, let it remind you that you, too, hold the power to make a difference. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what justice means to you. And if you believe more stories like this should be told, like this video and subscribe to the channel. Together, let's keep the roar of compassion alive, proving that even in the darkest moments, humanity still rides strong.